Okay, welcome everyone as you're coming in. This will be my first announcement to ask you to keep your microphone muted throughout the presentation. Welcome to the Cobblestone Museum program on Erie Canal, Waterway of Change. We're glad you're with us this evening. Look forward to a presentation by Elizabeth from the Syracuse Erie Canal Museum. So we'll give people just a little bit longer to get themselves settled here. Thank you for muting your microphones throughout the evening. If you keep your microphone muted at all times. At the and Sue will instruct you about entering your questions in the chat. And at the end of the evening, we'll run through the chat. Then at the very end of the evening, we invite you to unmute your microphones and speak directly with Elizabeth if you'd like, and let us know maybe where you're from and where you're watching from. That would be great. Looking forward to this evening's presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Sue Bonafini, the Assistant Director at the Cobblestone Museum.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our March virtual program, which celebrates the bicentennial of the Erie Canal and Women's History Month. Tonight's program is sponsored by Pat's Auto Repair in Albion, New York. We're thankful that owners Patrick and Marissa have provided support for our February and March virtual events this year. Thank you to each of you in the virtual audience for your support of the Cobblestone Society and Museum. Your registration donations at any level are appreciated, especially if you chose an option that provides greater funding. I encourage all of our viewers who have not visited our museum to consider a visit to our campus in the historic hamlet of Childs in Orleans County, 2 miles north of Albion, New York, about halfway between Rochester and Buffalo. We welcome visitors to our campus from May through October to take guided tours of our 8 campus buildings, which includes our 3 cobblestone National Historic Landmark structures. 2 additional buildings house our current self-guided exhibits featuring 19th century coverlets and Victorian mourning art and sundries. I want to welcome our first-time viewers, as well as those who have joined us for programs in the past. There are viewers from 9 states who have registered for this event. The majority of our viewers, of course, are from New York, many who currently or at one time lived in communities along the Erie Canal. Feel free to put those cities or towns into the chat box feature at the bottom of your screen, which our trustee, Chris Capurso, will monitor for our speaker. I also want to give a shout out to 6 alums of my alma mater, Mount Holyoke College, a women's college founded in 1837, who are part of our audience tonight. Now, tonight's speaker, Elizabeth Farrell, is the Assistant Director of Education and Public Programming at the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, New York. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in history from the University of Vermont. Following the path of many New Englanders before her, Elizabeth came to New York seeking opportunity on the canal. So Elizabeth, welcome, and please begin.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the Cobblestone Museum for having me. So this talk that I am about to give grew out of a reckoning at the Erie Canal Museum, where we reflected on what stories we were telling in the panels throughout our exhibits, and really noticed that that story was not very focused on individual people, and those who it did focus on portrayed a limited perspective of the history. So in the years and months since then, we have taken on the challenge initially to expand the stories we're telling, expand the narrative of the Erie Canal, include more perspectives and stories because it makes for an interesting history, a much more interesting history than just portraying, one experience. So this talk was really the first product of that reckoning because it's a lot easier to write a talk and talk to people than change all of our exhibits, but that is happening too. So this was written um, just over a year, no, sorry, yeah, a year and a half ago. So it has evolved a lot since it was first written, and it still does. But let me just get started. And I like to start with giving everyone a little bit of an overview of the canal, anchoring our minds in the canal, because not everybody thinks about the canal every day in the way that I might. So again, just starting from the time before the canal was built. The women of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, formerly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, lived in upstate New York from time immemorial. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is made up of 6 different indigenous nations who spread out throughout what is now New York State and beyond. And they lived in highly gendered but matriarchal structured societies. So women had uniquely female roles and there were uniquely male roles as well. But women of these nations were responsible for things like agriculture, food distribution. They had a voice in decision making and electing leaders within their nations. It's important to note that once the canal is built, it is built through the lands of all 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, essentially dividing their lands with a 40-foot wide waterway. So really disrupting the ways of life for these indigenous people. The canal also allows for many, many more white settlers to enter the region. And with white settlers comes policies of assimilation, forced displacement, all of which helped to end that matriarchal structured society for a lot of communities within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and those 6 nations. As those white settlers come into the region, there are increasingly white women settling throughout upstate New York, even before the canal was built. So white families are typically practicing subsistence agriculture at this point. They are working primarily on the family farm, women within the home, and outside of the cash wage economy as well, especially before the 1920s. And land is really the primary way that wealth is generated at this time. There's this really prominent idea at the time as well of the separate spheres, which assigns men to a larger sphere concerning themselves with politics, the state, the outside world. It's largely a bigger sphere than the sphere that women are relegated to. So this smaller sphere for women limits their concern to with the home, the family, maybe religion, those kinds of things. Again, really concentrated around the home. And it partly grew out of the ideas of Republican motherhood in the years after the American Revolution. This idea of Republican motherhood really taught that women were needed to raise good, loyal American sons in the years after the American Revolution. And kind of going along with all of this, women were believed to have no need for the vote at this time because they had brothers, fathers, sons, husbands to represent them electorally, so had no concern with voting. Going along with that, white women had relatively few rights in this era. Married women were not considered legal people. They could not have custody of their children in instances where their husband died. They couldn't own property of any kind. They didn't have the rights to their body and the labor that their bodies produced. No quote unquote respectable woman could work outside of the home, especially after marriage. And there are relatively few opportunities for education, especially higher education for women into the 1820s. Also, it will be important later on, but women were not permitted to speak publicly in this era, even among most groups of the Quakers for a while into the 1820s. Um, but we also must consider the free and enslaved Black women who were living in upstate New York at this time. So throughout the period that we will be discussing, especially in this first section where I detail the beginning of the canal, enslavement was legal in New York State. So we know that according to census records, there are continued instances of enslavement in upstate New York into the 1840s. So the canal is built from 1817 to 1825. In that era, there is still enslavement happening in New York. There are also free Black women living in New York at this time. They have very limited prospects open to them, and often were forced into jobs like working as laundresses, domestic servants, cooks, things like that. So even though white women have very few rights and don't have rights to their own labor or bodies, there are still these free Black and enslaved women with even fewer rights doing even more grueling forced labor at the time as well. Okay, so like I just mentioned, the canal is built from 1817 to 1825. It took about 8 years for this 363-mile long waterway to be built. When it was first built, it was 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, and then 363 miles long, and primarily dug by hand, and required a whole lot of labor. At first, a lot of those laborers are coming from Eastern New York, or New England, people who are coming from family farms to now seek out this beginning of a new kind of job. This is the first time a lot of them have access to jobs with little oversight, so no longer working on that family farm or no longer working under a trade master, but working as kind of this mass digging effort. Typically, the canal was being built through relatively sparsely settled and underdeveloped regions of the state. So canal contractors who were hiring these laborers had a need for in-kind payments rather than cash payments for their laborers. There's also not really a unified banking system in the United States until the 1860s, which makes it a little bit complicated to get cash when you're in what they would have called the frontier at that time. So as part of that, women do begin to get some of these jobs as well. You get women serving as cooks or boarding laborers in their homes along the path of the canal to some meager wages. They wouldn't really have been able to support themselves or a family on those wages, but they do kind of get access to this kind of thing. In addition to food, board, things like that, these men are being paid with whiskey rations. It's likely that canal diggers were drinking somewhere between a pint and a quart of whiskey a day. And we, of course, do have evidence that, water was not particularly safe to drink at this time. We also know from letters from people living in upstate New York at the time that these canalers, these diggers, are getting a reputation for excessive drinking before the canal is opened, and that will continue when the canal is open as well. So the canal opens in 1825. Like Sue mentioned, it is its 200th birthday this year. The canal really revolutionizes trade and travel throughout New York, and beyond, because now a journey that would have taken about 4 weeks to travel across the state now only takes 5 to 6 days. Um, it would have, before the canal, cost about $100 to move a ton of goods across the state. Now it only costs about 10. So there's new, easy access to lots of natural resources, and things are much cheaper and faster to move. And because of that, there's all of these new factories, mills, industrial centers that arise on the banks of the canal. And you also get people flooding into the region looking for these economic opportunities and jobs. But there's, again, this lack of oversight in these new kinds of canal side jobs, as well as people working on canal boats, because they're getting away from this model of family farms and trade masters. These young men also now have access to cash, increasingly, alcohol that they're being paid in. And I have heard people who have described conditions along the banks of the canal as like a frat house. There's widespread drunkenness. There's lots of gambling, fighting, crime, prostitution, all kinds of things like that. And folks throughout the canal corridor begin to notice that there's some problems with this industrialization and urbanization that's happening, and start to think about efforts towards reform and also societal control in these new cities along the canal. But you don't just get men flooding into the region, families come as well, and women so have access to increasing opportunities for work along the canal. So women get jobs on these canal boats. Most often they work as cooks, but families own and operate boats on the canal, and they often will have their daughters work as mule drivers, walking along the towpath with the mules, or serving as kind of boat hands. You even get women who will captain boats eventually along the Erie Canal. You also have all of these mills that arise on the banks, and women have access to these kinds of industrial jobs for low wages, particularly for unmarried women. Again, they were low wages meant to supplement a family's income rather than allow a woman to support herself on her own. But also, you have these new mass-produced goods that allow the emerging middle class and upper class to purchase goods rather than having to make them or have one of their domestic servants make these things for them. So they no longer have to make their own candles, weave their own flour, mill their own, no, sorry, weave their own fabric, mill their own flour, things like that, or use their servants to do so. These things are now available to be mass produced and then shipped along a canal boat to a general store, perhaps nearby. So that allows a new level of free time for some different women throughout the canal corridor. That's an important precursor to the reforms that follow on the banks of the canal. And with all of the urbanization, things change really quickly, and New Yorkers start to look for ways to reform their societies and their cities. Before the canal opened, because of the Appalachian Mountains and the difficulty to move throughout the state, the professional clergy of the East Coast can't easily reach Christians of upstate New York. So Christians of the region are often spoken about, as having practiced kind of a loose, unorganized form of Christianity, often referred to as a folk religion. But once the canal opens, you get professional clergymen who immediately begin to travel along the canal. So one of the people who does that is Charles Grandison Finney, who you can see in the top corner of the screen. He worked for a period as a lawyer in Jefferson County. He is ordained in 1824, and by 1825, the same year that the canal opened, he was on a canal boat preaching throughout the state. And he takes advantage of this new efficient waterway to preach a message of perfectionism. He was one of the main figures in a larger religious revival movement called the Second Great Awakening, that kind of preaches a message that gets Christians away from the ideas of Calvinist predestination. And specifically, Finney preaches that not only do individuals have a role in their own salvation, but they have a responsibility to root out sin in themselves and in their communities. He is not the only perfectionist along the canal corridor. You get a lot of people thinking this way, from Finney to the Oneida community, even Joseph Smith, kind of thinking about these new ideas of an individual's role in their salvation. So Finney travels throughout the canal corridor, and he sees a lot of success in terms of conversion. He sees the highest levels of conversion in these new canal-side cities. And there he preaches against these sins that are relevant in this moment. So he preaches against enslavement, drunkenness, prostitution, gambling, things like that. And urbanism is coming at a really, really fast rate at this time. And that means life is changing really dramatically fast for people. There's a really good example of this from here in Syracuse, where the 1820 census records tell us that there were 250 white settlers living in the Syracuse kind of settlement. But only 10 years later, in 1830, there are then 11,014 settlers living in Syracuse, which is 44 times larger than just a decade before. So I have kind of a hard time conceptualizing what that would have been like to, have the population in a relatively small settlement increase by 44 times in just a decade. And because these mass conversions are happening at the highest rates in the places experiencing really high levels of change, scholars have argued that religion is a trauma response to people. People turn to religion as a constant in this time of really dramatic change. And Charles Grandison Finney involves women in these mass conversion efforts that he leads. He persuades many to speak, to kind of give a testimony of their own religious conversions to audiences at these mass conversions, something that was largely unwelcomed by the separate spheres ideology at the time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband, while he was working in a canal office as a young man, are among these early converts of Charles Grandison Finney. But also women, as dictated by the separate spheres ideology, were the religious and moral authorities of the home. And they often, because of that, influenced the conversion of their husbands and sons and the men in their lives generally. So they're being welcomed into this religious revival fervor that's sweeping across the state, to give testimony, to participate in prayer groups, to volunteer with female moral reform societies. And so they begin to make networks and connections with other like-minded women. And in this way, especially with the public speaking, they are slowly beginning to creep outside of their assigned sphere as well. And not coincidentally, many people would move on and take action for temperance in the temperance movement as a result of this religious reform that's happening. Again, not coincidentally, a lot of their reform work throughout the state of New York is targeted at canalers. So some of those middle-class women who have convinced their husbands to convert Those husbands are often new middle-class employers throughout the canal corridor, and we have evidence that some of those people required oaths of temperance from their employees. So if you were not sober, you could not work for them anymore. There was also a newspaper article from 1843 in which a temperance society publicly pressured a man named Edward Latham, who was superintendent of the Cayuga Seneca Canal, to only hire sober employees, and to ensure that all of the lock tenders and laborers working under him were not selling alcohol along the canal. So there was a lot of pressure from this religious reform movement being pushed on to canalers. Um, and it's really hard to kind of exaggerate how closely connected the canal and mass drinking was. So as of 1835, we know that there were about 1,500 places to buy alcohol along the canal. The canal is just under 400 miles long, so that works out to about every quarter mile along the canal system. And this is just an interesting image we have in our collection. It's either from, winter time when they were doing some work on the canal bank while it was closed, or they would have drained a section for a period. So there's some work being done on this canal wall, but you can see in the upper left corner of the screen that that building just on the edge of the canal is in fact a liquor store. So these two things are happening really in conjunction along this waterway. Also, growing out of this general effort to reform society, lots of women begin to get involved in the abolitionist movement. And for some of them, this was connected to their ability to dedicate more time to reading and writing and joining things like sewing groups. So there were lots of these sewing groups who had an abolitionist bent. Often the way they worked was they would have one member who would read aloud from a anti-slavery tract, while the other members of the group sewed goods. And those goods were then sold at an anti-slavery fair or an anti-slavery bazaar as a way of fundraising for the abolitionist movement. They would take those profits from the sales. And one group we know did that as a way of fundraising for Frederick Douglass's North Star newspaper, which you can see at the top of the screen. And so that gives them a little bit of access to a public voice, right? Because they're funding a public newspaper. You also get women who begin to circulate petitions. At this time, they're circulating these petitions and gathering signatures to help end enslavement, but those are meant to be sent to petition or sent to politicians, and they are sent to politicians. And so women who are not meant to be concerned with politics are making their voices heard to politicians, and starting to get involved in the abolitionist movement, which at the time is an explicitly political debate. And some of those women go on to join anti-slavery societies. Those anti-slavery societies existed all over the Northeast and beyond. Female ones had all female members, all female leadership. There was one in Lockport, New York, and we know that the president of that group was married to a canal engineer, for example. Through these local societies, women connected with other like-minded women. And again, they're really now pushing these boundaries, getting involved in an explicitly political debate. And as they continue to work in this movement, they are at times required to speak in front of mixed gendered audiences, which at the time are referred to as promiscuous audiences. And there's a lot of pushback for them speaking to these mixed gendered audiences. Some men viewed women as a hindrance to the abolitionist and anti-slavery movements because they were supposed to be anti-political, and they opened up the societies to ridicule. Some people who were firm believers in the separate spheres ideology responded with violence at times. So there are instances where mobs burn down and attack lecture halls where women were speaking to these mixed gender audiences. And then in 1840, a prominent female abolitionist, Abby Kelly Foster, who had traveled throughout the canal corridor with Frederick Douglass using a canal boat on these tours. She was elected to serve on a committee within the American Anti-Slavery Society. And as a result of that election, many of the male members walked out of the conference where it was announced to protest her election to that position of power. And that leads to a division within the anti-slavery movement between those who supported female participation and those who saw women as a hindrance to the movement and hoped to silence their participation. And this moment in time really drove home to women participating in the movement their inequalities. So in the context of enslavement, these women are thinking about slavery as a contradiction of the American ideals of freedom, equality, justice, things like that. And these moments where they're being silenced are again driving home to them that they are not equal. They are in a situation that is a contradiction of those American ideals as well. And in the 1840s, women begin to circulate petitions to be sent to the New York State government demanding their own enfranchisement. One from 1846 says that if, quote, democratic governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, end quote, then New York was failing to live up to democratic ideals. So they're speaking out here politically, starting to get even more political. It's also important to consider that there were Black women participating in both of these movements, both the abolitionist and anti-slavery movements and the early suffrage movement. And those women were being silenced and ostracized by both sides. They were being denied rights both as women, but also as Black people in the United States. That is why you see Sojourner Truth on the screen. She was born enslaved here in New York. And in 1851, she gives a famous speech titled Ain't I a Woman at a women's rights conference, where she really embodies this position that Black women were being forced into between the movements as they were denied rights on multiple fronts. Despite these massive hurdles, Truth worked really extensively for a lot of reform causes throughout her life. And she serves as an interesting segue into the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 because she is believed to have attended. A bit more generally, Seneca Falls makes an interesting case study for kind of what I'm looking at here in this talk. So Seneca Falls is located still today on the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, which opened in 1828, so just a few years after the Erie Canal. And it connected these once small Finger Lakes villages to the economic opportunities and action that was happening on the Erie Canal. We also know that in the 1840s, there's a lot of kind of the same trends happening in Seneca Falls. So it's still developing these industries. Seneca Falls, we remember for the mills. The mills are quite famous there today still. It was experiencing lots of population influx as people moved into the area looking for these economic opportunities, both in the industries and exporting the natural resources available there. And we also know that there's some of this religious revival action happening as well. Again, we know that there was also reform work happening. So in 1843, for example, we know that the women living in the area held one of these anti-slavery fairs where they sold these sewn goods that they had created in order to fundraise for the abolitionist movement and also kind of teach about abolition. In the same year, there's evidence that those who were permitted to vote in Seneca Falls voted to ban the sale of alcohol in the town. Also, by 1848, it is the home of 4 out of the 5 women who organized the famous Women's Rights Convention there. One of those people was, of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her home was mere feet away from the canal. And so at that 1848 convention, the organizers introduced the Declaration of Sentiments, which famously declares that all men and women are equal, are created equal, sorry. It does a lot of things like state the many rights they believe are due to women, protests the legal death of married women, push back against the limited access to education and jobs, among many other points. And all of this was being declared really for the first time. And it's all happening just feet away from the canal system. So, like, you can still go today and see the proximity between these spots where this history is happening and the canal system. So, the Declaration of Sentiments was signed by 100 attendees, 68 of whom were women, 32 of whom were men. Many of them live in what I would call a canal town, meaning towns that are just off the Erie Canal or one of the canals that connects to the Erie, towns that the canals flow through, towns that owe their development, settlement, and kind of industrial scene to the canal system. And so many of these signers lived in places like Waterloo, Seneca Falls, two very close together towns. Places like Rochester, Syracuse, the villages around those cities as well. Additionally, many of those signers were members of families who made their money from canal-related industries. So industries that were dependent on the canal for the shipping of goods to be profitable. So throughout the 1800s, we know that the canal was really the main way that things were being shipped. By the 1880s, it peaked. That is the year it peaks, I believe. And then railroads really take over. But for shipping goods, it's really the canal for a long time. So that kind of economic side of families allows a lot of these women to participate in this kind of reform, to attend these conferences, to kind of learn about these activities. So the first of the people that I'm going to talk about who signed the Declaration of Sentiments is Rhoda Palmer. Rhoda Palmer grew up in Geneva, which was at the terminus of the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, to abolitionist parents. Her parents had moved to Geneva from New England to start a farm in the Finger Lakes region, which was kind of this trend that happens. You get people moving along the canal to settle, to farm. And before the canal is built, those people are the major advocates for building a canal. You can't make a profit from your surplus farm goods if you can't move them to market and sell them. As a young woman, Rhoda Palmer, for example, saw the first canal boat travel along the canal system in 1825 when it first opened. She also traveled extensively all over New York, into New England, into the Great Lakes region. But she started her journeys to those faraway places using the canal system to get to either the Great Lakes, to get towards Lake Champlain in Vermont, up that way. So she used the canal to expand her horizons, learn about these movements, attend conferences, things like that. So in 1848, she signed the Declaration of Sentiments, and then at 102 years old in 1918, she was able to cast her first ever ballot in a New York State election. But she is just one of the many signers whose lives and whose activism was really shaped by the canal and the possibilities that it brought to the region. All right. So Elizabeth McClintock is another signer of this document. She was born to a family of Quakers, originally in Philadelphia. They very likely used the canal when they moved from Philadelphia to Waterloo, New York. There are seemingly no images of her, which is why you see some of her family members on the screen now. Um, her family members were also very active in these different reform movements. But Elizabeth McClintock was the main planner of that 1843 Seneca Falls anti-slavery fair that I mentioned a few minutes ago. She was one of the 5 organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention. She helped draft the Declaration of Sentiments. She invited Frederick Douglass to attend. Also, very interestingly, in 1850, she is the only woman in Seneca Falls listed on the census with a profession, and that profession is a clerk at her father's drugstore. We know for sure that the goods that were being sold and used in that drugstore would have been shipped along the canal system to get down to Seneca Falls, making her family's livelihood dependent on the canal system. Um, Through the drugstore, they earned money that funded their activism. They also seemingly, just an interesting tidbit, had a little bookstore in that drugstore where they sold books that helped other people learn about abolition, women's rights, other kind of reform movements they were participating in. Another signer, you can see her marriage announcement here. Her name was Lydia Mount. She's listed here in this announcement as Lydia Hunt because that's her maiden name. She lived in Geneva. Well, she lived in Geneva and then Waterloo and then Seneca Falls. So really all around the same region. In this image from 1825, you can see that her husband is a merchant when they are married. He becomes quite well off and he buys multiple farms after they're married. He invests in various businesses, including becoming part owner of the Waterloo Woolen Mill in Waterloo. He ends up dying in 1842. But we know that Lydia survived off of the money he had made. So she signs the Declaration of Sentiments 6 years after her husband's death. Um, so by that time, she's living off of his money, though I'm sure she would have been earlier. And she is able to do things like go to this convention because she is economically stable. She does not have to work or seek out, a domestic servant job. And that mill, that Waterloo Woolen Mill, would have most definitely relied on the canal to move goods to market to make a profit. The last 2 people I'm going to mention are Lavinia and Hannah Latham. So if you have a keen memory, you might remember earlier I mentioned Edward Latham as the superintendent of one of the canals. Lavinia Latham was his mother, Hannah Latham was his sister. Both of them signed the Declaration of Sentiments. After her husband died, we know that Lavinia Latham was reliant on her sons to support her. Her sons had a well-known construction company called the Latham Brothers. We know that they did construction work along the canal's towpath. Throughout the Seneca Falls community, including building Olivia Bloomer's home, who's famous for the Bloomer costume. And that wealth that they were generating helped support their mother and sister. So in many ways, the canal provides kind of an economic through line for the women's rights movement, but we also know that it helps facilitate the communication and spreading of ideas, which I'm wondering if the Zoom boxes are covering some of this text, and if they are, I'm sorry. But the canal helps people move throughout the state on lecture tours, for example, on these petition campaigns, so people can move around the state, share their ideas, gain support, gain monetary donations as well. But also for a period, the mail is shipped, at least in part, on canal boats. And mail communication is really essential for the planning of things like these conventions, for sharing ideas, for publishing ideas in newspapers that are then shipped along the canal. So the canal also helps this transportation be facilitated throughout the state as well. All right, and the woman you now see on the screen, her name is Hester Jeffrey. She lived later, and she's just an interesting story because her life and activism is still really concentrated in these same canal towns. So she was a resident for much of her life of Rochester. She was a friend of Susan B. Anthony, and after Anthony's death, Hester Jeffrey founds the Susan B. Anthony Club of Rochester. Jeffrey also founds the Political Equality Club of Rochester. She attends statewide gatherings of organizations, for example, in these canal towns like I believe it's Buffalo. Yes, Buffalo in 1902. She attends the National Association of Colored Women Convention. And then in 1905, in Rochester, she attends the New York State Suffrage Association Convention. So even though she was working at a time when the train had really surpassed the canal in terms of people traveling along the state, her activism is still really concentrated in these cities that the canal gave rise to. Also, speaking of kind of later on in the movement, the Civil War kind of brings attention away from the women's rights movement because people begin to really turn their attention back to abolition. And you get lots of people advocating for what they call the universal suffrage. So suffrage for both Black men and all women. Let's see. This movement quickly falls apart after the Civil War because of debates and infighting over who, quote unquote, deserves suffrage first. At the time, there's this argument that Black men need the vote to protect their communities in the years after slavery has ended. You have other kind of women in the women's rights movement who argue that educated American citizen women deserve the vote. So you get this division of the women's rights movement as a result, and then a kind of loss of energy for a period. Additionally, in the 1880s, 1890s, the anti-suffrage movement gains traction in certain kind of communities throughout New York. They largely, they base their ideas in the inherent differences between men and women. They argue that women's ability to reform society should be an extension of their domesticity and really concentrated on the home. They interestingly organize in a lot of the same ways that the pro-suffrage people do as well. But by the 1880s and 1890s, lots of things had been achieved, even though the vote doesn't come for a few more decades. So the New York Married Women's Property Law was passed initially in 1848, and it allowed married women to own property. Its passage was really heavily influenced by powerful, rich white men, including a man named George Geddes, who was the son of one of the original canal engineers, James Geddes. George Geddes was part of the Senate. He introduced this bill in New York. He wanted to protect that canal-related inherited wealth for his daughter. His father had made a fortune as an engineer on the canal, but also like in the salt industry and other industries that kind of arose after the canal. And George Geddes only had a daughter, so he wanted his daughter to inherit that wealth rather than it pass to his son-in-law. Despite that, many women did lots of the early agitation for this law to gain support, to get it in front of people like Senator George Geddes. One of those is Ernestine Rhodes, who led an early petition campaign in favor of this law while she lived in Rochester. There were also many women who wanted to see this law expanded after its initial passage. So Susan B. Anthony was one of those people who worked really hard for that. She moved to Rochester on a canal boat as a child. from Massachusetts. She leads a months-long petition campaign where she travels to, like, I think it's every county in New York State, gaining support for the expansion of this law. She leads that campaign in 1854. In 1860, it is in fact expanded and allows married women to have custody of their children, to conduct business, to sign contracts, to sue and be sued, things like that, that give them more legal personhood. Also, in 1880, women begin to be able to vote in school board elections and to run for school board positions in New York. Matilda Jocelyn Gage leads a big portion of the fight for this right. She also, after it's passed, leads a group of women in her hometown of Fayetteville, New York, in actually asserting this right. So she leads this group of women to go cast ballots because there's so much voter intimidation, trying to prevent these women from casting ballots. Additionally, throughout the period from when the canal was built, access to education for women has expanded greatly. Initially around 1821, you get the all-female seminaries, for example, at Troy. But by the 1840s and 50s, women begin to have increased access to college educations across New York, even medical school, sometimes by accident, but increasingly so. And then by 1870, the major universities in New York, like Cornell and Syracuse, begin to fully allow women to attend. Going along with that, going along with access to education, you get an expanded access to jobs. Partially as a result of the Civil War, when women are needed to step into roles more like as teachers, as nurses, you also see increased access to the professions. So you get the first woman to graduate from medical school, Elizabeth Blackwell. She does that in 1849. Locally, this woman, Mary Edwards Walker, who was a native of Oswego, New York, another canal town. Well, the Oswego Canal has its terminus there. Mary Edwards Walker earns a medical degree in 1855 from Syracuse Medical College. She serves as a surgeon during the Civil War, and she earns a Medal of Honor for that service as well. You also, in addition to the medical profession, you have Belva Lockwood, who, again, you might not be able to see under some of the Zoom boxes here. Belva Lockwood enters the legal and political scene. So she was born in Royalton, New York, another canal town, where she serves as a school teacher and goes to college. But she ends up going to law school in Washington, D.C., and she becomes the first woman to earn a law degree at the National University Law School. Soon after that, she has to lobby Congress to permit her to the bar, and she did, in fact, become the first woman admitted to the Supreme Court bar in 1879. A few years later, in 1884, she runs for president on a third-party ticket, despite not being able to vote for herself. So while the 19th Amendment takes a long time to be achieved, there are changes happening that affect the lives of women. Though it is important to remember that at the same time, the majority of women in New York State are working industrial jobs. They are working class women who work at this time really insane hours in insane conditions, who are just not concerned with the women's rights movement, in part because they had not been actively incorporated into the women's rights movement. But around the turn of the 20th century, there's a new energy brought back to the women's rights movement as a younger group of women enter the leadership. One of those people is Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Excuse me. Blatch had spent some time in the UK where she learned about their suffrage movement, which is remembered as a bit more militant and extreme than the American one. So Blatch brings back some of these tactics. She also incorporates working class women. She works with labor unions. She works with female workers, people who had largely been ignored by her mother's generation. Blatch also embraces this idea of open air meetings. So they hold parades and marches in New York City, in Washington, D.C., but they also hold meetings in public places where people can hear and attend. They also plan something called the Canal Boat Campaign. It's planned for 1908. It's announced in the newspapers as a tour along a canal or on a canal boat along the canal system from Seneca Falls through the canal to Albany on the 60th anniversary of that original 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. The idea is to get attention back to their movement and get new energy brought to their cause. It seemingly never materialized. Some newspaper reports say that it's because the captain of the canal boat was injured. Others say that it's because Blatch was just too busy. But it is telling that they had this idea to bring this energy back to the canal itself. But after much work from this younger generation, the 19th Amendment was passed and then ratified in 1920, which guaranteed the right to vote could not be denied based on sex. Very interestingly, in 1923, the same younger generation of women, specifically Alice Paul, introduces the Equal Rights Amendment in Seneca Falls at the 75th anniversary celebration of the 1848 convention. And so the ERA, introduced in 1923, attempts to ensure that all rights, not just the right to vote, but all rights, cannot be denied based on sex. Just like the fight for the 19th Amendment, that Equal Rights Amendment has been a really long fight, decades long, over a century at this point. It has still not been ratified throughout the United States. It has in New York, but I think that a lot of those things that these women were thinking about at the Seneca Falls conventions have not yet legally fully been achieved. All right, that is all I have. I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I just want to say to the audience that although I introduced our trustee as being the person who would monitor the chat, unfortunately, she had a family emergency this evening and is not with us. So I invite you, if you're interested, to just unmute yourself and directly ask Elizabeth a question. I think we have a small enough group where we could do that. Is there anyone who has a question for her now?
Elizabeth, would you turn off your screen share so we can see more people?
Yes, of course. There we go.
Or if you'd like to just make a comment. I mean, some of you I know live along the canal, grew up along the canal. If you want to share a comment, you can do that as well.
Just thanking you again, Elizabeth. I think that was a great presentation. I learned quite a bit. I think
That's so cool.
I guess I used to think that I knew a lot about the canal, so it was nice to learn some more. And we did make a recording this evening. If for some reason anyone would like to view the recording, that'll be ready tomorrow morning. Just email us and we'll give you the link for that recording. And if for some reason someone wasn't able to attend that had made a provision to attend, we'd be glad to give them that link as well.
This is Lyndon Harold from Rochester, and I'll just echo those comments. No specific question, but fantastic talk covering all the ways that the canal, the tributary canals, and the settlements, everything worked together and then came back full circle. So thank you for putting this all together.
Of course. Thank you so much. I think you left the comment earlier about the exhibit at the Everson. So thank you for that as well. We currently have an exhibit in the Everson Museum of Art, kind of a collaboration between them and our artists in residence that's up right now. So thank you for that.
This nice weather in mid-March is getting us all eager to be out and about and maybe get things going at the museums again.
Yes. I also see that someone asked if there were any special plans for the canal's 200th birthday. Um, let's see, in September leading into October, the Buffalo Maritime Museum has built a replica canal boat, built a replica of the very first canal boat taken by DeWitt Clinton. So that will be traveling through the canal system, and there are lots of stops planned throughout the state, and those are kind of that's like the crown jewel of the bicentennial this year. So you can go onto their website, Buffalo Maritime Museums, and learn more about that. That's what I would encourage people to look into for the 200th anniversary, though there are tons of things happening all over the state.
Here locally in Orleans County, in addition to the canal's bicentennial, we're celebrating the bicentennial of Orleans County. So we have a committee working with the county historian at this point to create events and excitement and buzz around our bicentennial as well. So we're also looking forward to the arrival of the Albany Symphony in Medina in early July, where they're going to have a presentation of some brand new music composed for the bicentennial, featuring sounds of the Erie Canal that they visited Medina, New York, to kind of capture some special sounds that are unique to Medina. So I'm very eager to hear what that symphony will sound like. Anyone else want to give a shout out? Just say where you're from and tell us about how the weather is and where you're sitting.
Jean, if you want to say something, you can unmute.
Hi. You wanted to know where we're from?
Sure, go ahead.
I live in Oswego, New York.
Yeah,
I
great.
grew up in Newark, right on the Erie Canal.
Is there still some vestige of the Oswego Canal?
Oh yeah, there's locks in the canal. If you want to take a boat from Lake Ontario, they take them to Oswego and they go down through the canal system and literally take their boats to Florida through Oswego.
Great.
Yeah. It's a big deal. The locks are a big deal.
Yeah, we have
a little bit of hydroelectric power.
We have the Flight of Five in Lockport, which is being restored to its 1840 condition.
Oh, wow. Wow.
This is Judy. I'm from Rochester. I was interested to hear about Belva Lockwood because she married a relative of mine.
Who was it, Judy?
My relative?
Yes.
Oh, well, his last name is McNall.
That's right.
She married a McNall, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot about her in Niagara County history because she was a Niagara County resident. So in my previous existence, I did a lot of studying about her.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Judy and Jean are both part of the Mount Holyoke contingent on this evening's call.
Well, that's why I had to mention that Susan B. Anthony started her journey to Rochester from Massachusetts when she moved as a child.
Yes, and Linda is part of the same Mount Holyoke alum group.
Hello, alums.
Hello.
You have an alma mater song you want to share?
Not really. We do have a song, but I'm not part of the glee club or anything.
Okay. We'll forgive you.
All right.
So
Well,
I guess we've done our thing here tonight.
And thank you again, Elizabeth, for sharing all that information. I'm sure everyone who's lived along the canal or been to your museum, I'm sure you probably presented something that we hadn't heard before.
That's the goal. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
All right. Everyone can have a good evening, I hope. And we'll be back next year with another series of programs. This is the last of our series of virtual programs for 2025. So thank you so much for your support.
But we've got lots of things to do in person if you visit. So
This is true. A lot of things on our agenda. And you can always go to our website where you registered for our program and keep an eye on the upcoming events.
So good night, Sue.
Good night. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to try to save the chat before we go, but I'm not very good at doing that. Let's see if I can do it. I still am not good at doing this. And Doug, I know that if I don't save it before we depart, then I'll lose it. Let's
I'm just going
see.
to turn off the recording here. Like I said, the
Okay.
recording will be available starting tomorrow. If anyone wants to listen again, just let us know.